Welcome everyone. Good afternoon for the Insights 2021 festival session on data for the head and stories for the heart. I'll introduce the session and our speakers properly in a moment, but before I do, here's just one or two ground rules that we're using for these sessions. I can get my slides to work. First of all, if you could please keep your microphone muted throughout the session, and as you've already begun to introduce yourselves in the chat box, because we'd love to know who is in the sessions. Please also use the chat box. Give us some questions through the chat box. I'll gather them up and I'll put them to our speakers, and also use that as a route to raising any technical issues that you may have. It's important that you know the sessions, all of these sessions are going to be recorded and put up on our website. So basically just treat it as a public session. And finally, I will just encourage you to tweet, and when you do so, to use our hashtag, which is at the bottom of the slides there, and also tag in the Midlands Decision Support Unit and the Strategy Unit. So the session today, data for the head, stories for the heart. It's a session I'm very, very much looking forward to. The basic premise of the session is that we simply don't talk enough about death and about dying. We don't talk enough about those topics as individuals, and often we miss the opportunity for conversation with loved ones, with family members, with friends. And we don't talk enough about death and dying as a society and as a nation. And the result of that lack of conversation, that lack of engagement and debate, is that very often the care that we receive and the experiences that we have at the end of life are not what they could and not what they should be. So the thought behind this session then is, can we combine different sources of insight, different sources of intelligence to improve things? Can we draw upon the very human power of story to help us make sense of things and to touch us in very human and sometimes very emotional ways, with the persuasive force, the intellectual power of data, which can help us to see things perhaps on a broader scale, perhaps at the population level and in a slightly more abstracted way? Can we combine those very different things? Can we combine data for the head with stories for the heart to improve things? Now, to explore those fascinating questions, we've got three brilliant speakers. Our first speaker is Catherine Mannix. She's a former palliative care consultant who pioneered the use of CBT in her practice and is currently a writer. And I can personally attest to the power and the warmth and the humaneness of Catherine's writing in her books. First of all, with the end in mind, which personally helped me to understand the process of death and dying. And secondly, with her current book, Listen, which is a book which helps to equip us in the approach to more tender or more difficult conversations across a whole range of different areas. And our second speaker, Justine Wiltshire, she is a senior analyst at the Strategy Unit, and I'm proud to say a wonderful colleague of mine. And she's done a lot of work on palliative care and end of life. And she's going to talk to us a bit about a piece of work that she led, where she looked at every single death in the Midlands region in 2018-19 and looked at people's use of services over the last 2 years of their life. And I know one of the things that really fires Justine up is the opportunity to use her data and use her analysis to improve care. So I'll be interested to hear her take on it. And then our third speaker today is Ollie Minton, who is a palliative care consultant and an academic at University of Hospitals, Sussex. Ollie is a very enthusiastic, very engaged, very persuasive, very powerful local clinician who really wants to use data and story to improve care for the local population down there in Sussex. I also think Ollie might be the reason why the four of us, Catherine, Justine and I and Ollie met, because he must be one of clinical Twitter's most prolific contributors. So I think it was actually him that put the four of us together and gave us the idea for this session. Anyway, so without further ado, I'd like to hand over now. Catherine's going to begin the session, and so I'd like to hand over to her now. So thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Fraser. Just making sure that I'm unmuted and found the right set of slides and all that technical stuff. This was a great conversation on Twitter that started us off, and I'm really, really delighted to be here. What I want us to think about, and oh, slides not progressing. There we go. What I want us to think about is how we understand healthcare, how we understand end-of-life care. And one of the things that the media and the newspapers in particular recognize is the importance of a good story. And very often they will hang a story around the release of data, and they will create stories around it to make personal interest for their readers, because they don't think that graphs will sell newspapers. They think photographs, headlines, and stories will sell newspapers. And so these three stories are all stories over time that have come from data and being converted by the media into stories. But my fourth headline is only a story, and it would have been only a story, except that this was one of many stories. And in fact, this was the index case for the Gosport scandal. And so this slide really is to remind us all that stories alone don't hold the power to change opinion when they remain as anecdote. It's stories in the context of a bigger picture, which is described better by data, that help us to really understand what's going on in a system. But stories are the way that we make sense of things, and we have always used stories to make sense of things, of danger, of death, of impermanence, of othering. And just in case you can't see the love interest here, there he is. So we've used stories since very earliest times to explain the ways in which, for example, the Little Mermaid was prepared to give up immortality and accept death in order to be able to have legs and be able to court her prince. We've talked about matters that are too great to talk about in a straightforward way, and we continue to do that. So here's a very modern myth. Here's Harry Potter, the boy who lived, and the reason that he lived was that his mother's love was stronger than death. So we use stories to help us to understand the really important things. But the difficulty, and Fraser alluded to this in the introduction, is that generally, as a nation, we've forgotten what ordinary dying is like. And because we don't know, we don't see when we're served myth instead. So our soap operas love death. It's a really great way of embroiling the public and getting them in and keeping them in and hooking them into storylines. But the storylines have to be unusual and spectacular in order to maintain people's interest. We're entertained by death. We are fascinated by the macabre and the terrifying, and we will do that thing where a thing that frightens us also makes us laugh. Or we are convinced by by newspaper stories that report hospitals and community healthcare disasters in the same way that they latch on to plane crashes and near misses, but never report the planes that take off and land on time and safely at the right destination. So we need to take some of what we read and see with a pinch of salt. But how would we know that if we don't know what ordinary dying looks like? And I think this particular story is the most difficult myth we currently have to deal with. The lack of understanding of the true role of cardiopulmonary resuscitation as a first aid measure when somebody's heart stops, but the rest of their body was functioning reasonably well. And by artificially causing a circulation of the oxygenated blood that's in the lungs, we can possibly save the person's brain and other vital organs from irreparable damage until the heart can be restored, if it can be restored, which it can be in around about 10% of people who have a cardiac arrest outside hospital, and maybe around 20% of people who have a cardiac arrest in hospital. Those data are not known by the public, but the story of somebody who had CPR and survived is always known. And so the public do not understand the difference between CPR as a first aid in a crisis and the inopportune use of CPR when somebody's heart stops, not first when everything else is working, but last at the very end of that process of ordinary dying. And so I've made it my latter part of life's work to try and encourage better discussion of ordinary dying. And that's when I came across the work of the strategy unit and was entranced by the sets of data presentation that Justine is now going to talk to us about.
Catherine, I'm just going to take a second to share my screen with you all. While I do that, I just wanted to mention that all the analysis I'm sharing with you this afternoon is at a Midlands level. We did actually do these reports for each STP as they were then in the Midlands, but all the slides today are at a Midlands level. And also, just to mention that in today's session, I'm just going to go through a couple of key highlights from the reports. If you wanted to see the full versions, they're available on the strategy unit website. So before we look at the analysis, I just want to really briefly mention in a little more detail all the data that's underpinning our end-of-life care report. So we have access to mortality data, which is information that's collected when a person dies and their death is registered. And we know from this that we're just over 93,500 adult deaths in the Midlands in 2018-19. Obviously, 2018-19 is a period which predates COVID. Therefore, throughout all of our analysis, there's no effect from COVID, and it represents a more normal or business as usual situation for end-of-life services. Data is linked for each deceased adult to their activity data occurring in the 2 years prior to their death, where patient-level activity data is available to us. We don't have access to data from all services. For example, we don't have social care or primary care or community. But the data we do have does encompass a wide array of different services, and it gives us a very granular linked patient-level data set with a wealth of detail. So now for the analysis. Firstly, we're looking to see how the number of deaths has changed over time and how we believe it will change in the future. Historically, we see that since around about 2011, the number of deaths has been increasing, and also that the gap between genders has been closing. The predicted deaths, which are represented by the dashed lines and available from the Office for National Statistics, these show a further continuous and sustained increase in the number of deaths is expected. And also in the predicted deaths, we start to see males overtaking females for the first time, and male deaths continue higher throughout. So what does this mean? Well, services are already caring for the decedent population and on a continuous basis. As the size of that population is expected to grow, so too will the demand on services. Between 2020 and 2030, the size of the decedent population in the Midlands is expected to grow by 18%. So in just 10 years, a significant increase in the size of the decedent population. If we look at age group, for future decedent populations, we can clearly see that the growth in deaths is for those dying when they're older, particularly those who are aged 85 and over. So the specific needs for older members of the decedent population are going to have a bigger impact on future demand for services. Moving on now to consider where people die. Overall, 47% of deaths or adult deaths in the Midlands took place in hospital, but that profile does differ by the different causes of death. So the chart here, it's called a MECO chart, and it's quite similar to a stacked bar chart. It's similar and it's got the vertical stacked columns, but it differs in that the width of the columns also indicates scale. Here we see the largest proportion, or the widest column, are for deaths in frailty, and within frailty, around a third of all deaths, 34%, are recurring in a care home. And that's the highest proportion for that particular setting, as we'd expect for those dying from frailty. Cancer is the next highest cause of death, with around a fifth of all decedents in this group. And also in this group, there's the highest proportion of deaths in a hospice, again, as you'd expect, given the nature of hospices around providing care for long-term incurable illness. And there's very few hospice deaths in the other causes of death. Organ failure and sudden death, both of these have a high proportion dying in hospital, although still between a quarter to a third are dying at their home location. And then other terminal illness, it's the smallest group within the decedent population by far. In this group again, there's a large proportion dying in hospital. And looking at place of death now by deprivation quintiles, here we have the most deprived quintile on the left, moving up to the least deprived or the most affluent on the right. And between quintiles, there were more deaths in hospital for the most deprived, and that seems to be almost a substitution with deaths in care homes, as the most deprived also had the fewest deaths in the care home. For deaths at home and deaths in a hospice, they're much more similar across the different quintiles. So now we know something about our decedent population in the Midlands. We know how many adults there are, and we know how many are expected in the future. We know about their age and we know about their gender. We also know about their cause of death and also where they die. But what about the services that they actually access in the 2 years prior to their death? So before we look at access, I'll just mention how we categorise our data. So we've grouped activity into 4 different activity types, which we use throughout our reports. So we have urgent service events, we have planned contacts, we have planned admissions, and we have bed days. Within each of these, there are a range of services included. So for example, urgent service events includes emergency admissions. It also includes A&E attendances and calls to 111 as well. So here we have the proportion of the decedent population who access each activity type in the 2 years before they die, meaning the proportion of people who have at least one contact with these areas. So a large proportion, 95%, so nearly everybody, are accessing urgent services at least once. For planned contacts, access is also high, with 87% of people accessing these. Planned admissions, access is lower at 40% of the decedent population having at least one planned admission. And then critical care access much lower at 12%, so a small proportion of the decedent population having at least one spell in critical care. And then by the different services within each activity type, we can see access for emergency admissions and A&E are both high. Each of these are accessed by 85% or over of the decedent population. For 111, access is much lower, but still 64% of people picking up the phone and making a call to 111. In planned contacts, the majority of access is coming from access to an outpatient appointment, and then nearly a quarter of decedents, 23%, having some contact with mental health. And there's a very small amount there for IAPT, which is the access to psychological therapies. Within planned admissions, it's mainly a mix of day case and electives. Around twice as many decedents are accessing day cases compared to those who are accessing elective admissions. For critical care, we split this into critical care that's the result of an emergency stay, or critical care that's the result of an elective stay. So we can see here that when people in the decedent population are accessing critical care, it's much more often as a result of an emergency admission. So beyond accessing services is how people interact with all services, when and to what extent. So now we're moving on to consider end-of-life pathways and what those might look like. Here we have just one patient with their healthcare representing a sort of barcode over the last year of life, and I'll talk to this example in a little more detail just to help with understanding the slides that follow. So we have days across the bottom. So day 0, excuse me, I've lost my, there we go. Day 0 represents the day on which a person actually dies, and day 365 represents exactly a year before a person dies. We can see here the blue line is a planned admission, and that's followed by a stay in hospital. The stay in hospital is represented by the paler blue. The patient's then discharged, then they have an emergency admission, and they're also staying in then as well for around about 2 weeks. Then they have a planned contact, then they have another planned admission, but this time there's no stay in hospital. Then you can see activity starts to happen much closer together. There's quite a few contacts, a couple of planned admissions, and there starts to be more emergency care as well. And in this particular example, the patient has a final emergency admission, stays in hospital, and then goes on to die in hospital. So In that example on the previous slide, we saw just one patient. Here now, we're looking at a random sample of 15 patients from the frailty group. And viewing it like this allows us to consider whether there might be any healthcare experiences which are common across people who are dying from frailty. And here in this group, I would say most people at some point are having an emergency admission and staying in hospital after that emergency admission.
Justine, just sorry to interrupt you, but the slide hasn't advanced. We're still looking at the barcode.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not quite sure what's happening.
Excellent. There we are.
So this should see frail patients now. What does a pathway look for patients who die because they are frail?
Yeah, I'm seeing that, Justine.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter. So I'll just talk through this slide again, just in case anybody's missed it. Apologies for that. So here for the frail group, I'd say that most people at some point are staying in hospital after an emergency admission, but not so many people are going on to die in hospital. In the cancer group, it's a much more dense picture, lots more activities happening. So they often have a series of planned contacts, many planned admissions, and these where they're staying in hospital for a period of time. Urgent service events and any associated bed days, generally these taking place close to death, perhaps most likely in the 3-month period prior to death. Then for organ failure, quite a lot of urgent stays for this group, and these often become longer the closer to death that a person is. For sudden death, there are planned contacts throughout the last year of life, then urgent bed days again cropping up, particularly at end of life, and often in this group resulting in a death in hospital. In the other terminal illness group, it's quite a mixed picture here, but it stands out that a proportion are having some very long lengths of stay and more so towards end of life. And where we see urgent bed days interrupted or intersected by urgent service events, this is quite often representing transfers between trusts. And so on this slide, we see the 4 main pathway groups together. And I think when you see them side by side like this, it's easier to compare and see how patterns differ between the different cause of death groups. So moving on from those small samples of 15, we're now considering what for everybody in the adult decedent population in the Midlands, and what would their pattern of use look like by proximity to death. So in this chart, we're looking at the use of urgent service events in the 2 years prior to death for Midlands decedents, and we're looking at this by proximity to death in days. So we have the data points. These give the rate of activity by the daily proximity to death, and the example highlighted here shows the amount of activity taking place on day 0, or again, the day on which people die. And then we have a curve which we've modelled through the data points. And this gives a sort of pattern of service use. In our reports, we've looked to describe these curves in a few short sentences, and here for urgent service events, we say that they start low and increase slowly for much of the period. Then in the few months prior to death, there's a rapid rate of increase rising to a sharp peak. Now, considering the other types of activity and how their pattern of use might look, here we have planned admissions, and they don't quite start from 0, but they do start low, and they then increase steadily over the 2-year period. They come to a rounded peak around about 3 months before death, at which point use of these services starts to decline. Then planned contacts. These start higher from around about 15 activities, but they too increase steadily over the 2-year period, and they come to quite a sharp peak a matter of weeks before death. Bed days and critical care both have a similar shape to urgent service events, although for critical care it's a bit more concentrated in that period very close to death. But certainly the patterns of use are similar in that they start low, they increase slowly, and they rise to a sharp peak. The reason behind this, as we've seen on previous slides, is that bed days and critical care for the decedent population, mainly they're associated with emergency admissions. So the patterns of use are linked, and therefore the curves do look quite similar. That's the final slide from me on the analysis, but one last thing to share with you is some reflections around the role of the analyst. So I think one of the strengths of analysts is their ability to help tell the story for a whole population. We're able, through the data we use, to look at entire populations of people and see potential patterns, or problems or issues which might be looming on the horizon. Personally speaking, in previous work, I think my focus has been on producing a good output, and by good output, I mean a nice looking, well presented chart. But I wasn't really thinking about the story contained in those charts. And I think in working on this report with my colleagues in the strategy unit, but also clinicians who are working in end-of-life care, I came to a sort of increasing realisation about how analysts, we might not traditionally be seen as storytellers, but actually we can use our analysis to tell a story, and just how important this can be. But no analyst is an island, and analysis by itself isn't enough. So before I hand you back to Catherine, I just want to recognise how powerful relationships between analysts and clinicians can be, and how by working together, we're more able to engage with people, tell our stories, and help deliver improvements in future care. It's back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Justine. And I'm picking up from where we left off before, because I was entirely taken into these data sets, and my curiosity, which is of course Columbo's principal feature, that he's curious about what's going on, my curiosity was piqued. And so I started to look through these reports, and we've already seen what how these data are represented. But as I was looking at several of them, it made me start to wonder what's been going on here. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about this interesting patient journey, which starts with regular planned contacts and then ends in this person spending almost all of their last 5 months in hospital, and how different it is, how it contrasts with this person who has had regular planned contacts until something that looks like it's probably been a terminal event. And I want to propose to you that by looking at these individual journeys in more detail, so let's start with this one, let's try and find out about the person behind that bar chart. So here's Bob, and Bob is celebrating his 90th birthday. He lives with his wife. They are supported by a daughter who lives nearby. They're not terribly well off. Bob is diabetic and he has really sore feet, and he's regularly visited by a chiropodist from the diabetes team. So here's his chart, and let's look at those planned contacts. And then every now and again, there are contacts that are actually at the hospital. And this is because the chiropodist wanted to do something about an ingrowing toenail. Because of Bob's diabetes, they needed to be very careful about his feet. And so he was brought in order to be able to have his ingrowing toenail managed using local anaesthetic. So things are, if you'll pardon the pun, bobbing along okay. And then suddenly Bob woke up in the middle of the night, incredibly breathless, and was admitted to hospital with what was his first episode of left ventricular failure. Now, he's already known to have a poor circulation, so this isn't a great surprise to anybody. He actually took a little while to get better from that, was sent back home, and then a few weeks later, same thing happened again. And during that episode of care, an abdominal aortic aneurysm was noticed. Now, although Bob has sore feet and not a great circulation, he takes great pride in walking to buy his newspaper to his local shop and back every single day. That's a really important component of his quality of life. And that's one of the reasons that people are working so hard to keep his feet comfortable. And the risk of circulatory disaster was so great that it was decided that they would investigate further and see whether Bob could have some protective graft of his abdominal aneurysm. So here's his surgical assessment, outpatient visit, and then about 6 weeks later, he's admitted electively to the hospital to have his aortic abdominal aneurysm treated. So that is a successful procedure. He goes home, he continues walking for his newspaper, and then he develops very severe chest pain whilst walking for his newspaper, is admitted to hospital, and now his travails begin. He's actually had a myocardial infarction, he's had a heart attack, he's got quite serious heart failure as a consequence of that. As he's rehabilitating, he falls over in hospital and breaks his neck of femur. So now he's transferred internally within the hospital to an orthopedic ward, and he has a replacement of one of his hip. And now, as he's gradually rehabilitating, there's a planned trip to geriatric rehab, which is in a different hospital, and he's doing well with his geriatric rehab. When he develops more chest pain, goes back to the acute hospital and eventually manages to have a little while at home before he develops a very, very painful white leg. And what's happened is that Bob actually now has thrombus in his femoral artery. He needs to have emergency surgery, palliatively now, in the hope of saving the leg, but mainly in the hope of reducing his pain. And the surgery itself is successful, but Bob doesn't recover properly from his anaesthetic, develops a chest infection and dies in hospital. All the way through this, Bob's wife and daughter are pushing him to have more and more treatment. And what's interesting about this timeline is to think about what might have happened, what could have happened if particular conversations had taken place at key points. Because what mattered most to Bob was being at home, walking for his newspaper, living with his wife that he's been married to for 60 years. So if being at home matters most, what do we need to know about Bob in order to help to keep him there? If he is going to come into hospital to have an elective surgical procedure that is not without danger, then having a realistic conversation now about the place of cardiac compressions or defibrillation, if he should have a cardiac arrest during the surgery, would have been an important part of helping to start to orientate Bob towards the fact that a guy in his 90s with advanced diabetes and lots of vascular disease is now facing the last part of his life. And one of the conversations that could have been so helpful for Bob in the decision-making about what to do, for example, about his hip fracture, would have been the appointment of somebody with lasting power of attorney, maybe his daughter, maybe his wife, maybe them jointly, so that they knew what was most important to him. And also, should he take really unwell at home, is dialing 999 and coming into hospital the most helpful thing for him? Or are there treatments that can be offered at home that enhance his quality of life in the place where he wants to be, instead of hijacking him into hospital that then sets off a series of events like dominoes, which then uses up the last good few months of his life in hospital admission? So Bob's story is important, and the accurate mapping of Bob's story in that barcode is really important, but it's only going to make a difference to services if we think about how Bob's story can reinforce the messages that are in those data. The story next to Bob's is intriguing because it's so different. So let's find out whose story that is. This is Nicola. Nicola is 18. And Nicola is a young woman who's got complicated neurological and learning disabilities. And as a consequence of that, here is Nicola, age 17, receiving regular outreach from the Children's Disability Team. So she's having nutritional advice, behavioural support, bowel management. She has a tendency towards really difficult to manage constipation and management of seizures that regularly punctuate her illness. She has visits at home because she prefers to be at home, but her care needs are so great that she also has regular planned admissions to a local facility. And during that time, her mum has a chance to recoup and recover, even though she still visits Nicola every single day. But those admissions very often include light sedation so that Nicola can have manual evacuation of her bowel so that her constipation doesn't make her horribly uncomfortable. Nicola's difficulty was that she turned 18 at this point. And once she turned 18, her parents were no longer able to consent for her treatment. And Nicola lacked the mental capacity to be able to make those decisions for herself. So now Nicola develops abdominal pain, but she doesn't want to go to hospital. And because she's now 18, her refusal is taken as a competent refusal. The abdominal pain became worse. Eventually, it became so severe that she was taken into hospital, but she wept and she begged and she was taken home. And so on the very last day of her life, she collapsed at home. She was grey, she was clammy, she was groaning and rubbing her tummy. She was admitted to hospital where she died. She was clearly septic when she arrived, and post-mortem showed that she'd perforated her bowel. So Nicola's story makes us ask ourselves some questions about how things could have been different. What might have happened if there'd been earlier introduction as this young person reached the portal of transition into adult services? What could have happened if actually locally there was a transition service that would handle the complexities which are handled by often the children's community paediatric service, but actually fall into the realm of a neurology and adult gastroenterology services once the person turns 18? And what if there'd been some prior thinking and advanced care planning for what was going to happen once Nicola turned 18, and some best interest decision making, because parental consent would no longer be valid, in order to write some care plans and some anticipatory care that could have helped her to live better, to avoid constipation, and therefore not to die of something that was remediable at such a tragically young age. So this is about us thinking about the people behind the barcodes in order to go back and think about what we know and how it impacts individuals. Because data are really, really powerful. But data without the stories don't tell us the whole picture. We can't make business case decisions unless we've got access to reliable data. Decision makers need to understand what the data mean for them, for their whole population. This is about a big picture. It helps us to make sense of what's happening across the whole area, across the whole country, in individual organizations and services. But it's the stories that help us to relate those data to what's happening to people, to families, and to small groups. And that's why our Twitter conversation suggested we needed data for the head, stories for the heart. And that's why we're sitting here today to think about that. I'm handing over now to Ollie.
Thank you very much. So, IT aside, what I was going to, that's my colleague giving us, turning up to 11 feedback. There's a reference there that Sir Michael Marmot should get. I feel very proud of this sort of being told that I'm an academic when I'm just a clinician who has an interest in data. And so what I asked Justine and Fraser and the strategy unit was to produce a report for Sussex, because I absolutely believe in the importance of data. And I've picked out some of the things from our report, which hopefully augment what's being said, really, that I think everyone ends up having an emergency attendance in the last 2 years prior to their death. And for anyone who's been at any particular time, let alone when you're really unwell, it's just horrid and you don't want to be there. And if you're lucky, you get admitted to hospital. If you're unlucky, you can spend 24 hours or more on a hospital trolley. What I love to quote, and what I think in the context of all this, and the context of what I do in my day job, which is to see people who are probably in the last few days rather than the last year of life, is that 30% of people who come through the front door are in the last year of their life. We know that now. This is other data from the Royal College of Physicians, and it stands up nationally and internationally. And the important thing of that is that you could probably tell, any one of you could tell, you can look at somebody and say, would I be surprised if somebody was dead in a year? And you'd only be right half the time, but actually you don't need any special skills to do that. And unfortunately, what we haven't got on top of that is any special magic formula other than experience. We haven't got any magic blood tests like the Daily Mail would want us to have, or any magic scans that we can do. We can't really tell. What we probably can tell you is that of those people that come through the front door, 10% of those people will die on that admission, and they won't be in hospital for very long. They're in there for a couple of days. Now, this isn't about saying the hospitals, so what I would say, the message I want to get over is, hospitals actually are a place where you come to die. Justine showed that 50% of the population will still die in hospital. So we need to be good at it. We need to recognise it. We need to be compassionate about it, because it's not necessarily the place that people want to be. It links back to Catherine's talk, thing about what's important to people. And I would say the most important thing in all of this is communication, to paraphrase Tony Blair. Now, some of that's written down, some of that's IT, some of that's just, generally bunged into the ether, like I do on Twitter when I say I don't really want ECMO, thanks very much, lads. And everyone just goes, well, what do you want us to do? I say, well, if I ever get to the point where my heart stops beating and resuscitation doesn't work, I don't want the big pipes put inside me, thanks very much. And that's my ARDT as it stands at the moment, just for reference. When you go back to the big money and the big sort of talk about why are we talking about the last years of life, isn't that really very depressing? Well, if you put the Boris hat on, if I was Sajid David at the Tory conference, I'd actually say, look, about a third of the NHS money is spent on people in the last year of life. Now, rightly or wrongly, that's just a fact. Now, a lot of that is good money because that makes people feel better, makes them live longer. A lot of that is money that potentially, and I just say this out, that could be spent elsewhere. My personal bias to all this is, I think, very much people are over-treated at the end of their lives. And it goes against the Daily Mail stories that Catherine was talking about, because obviously, if you feel you've been denied something or it's negligence or anything like that, then that makes the front page of the Daily Mail. What doesn't make the front page of the Daily Mail is somebody who spends months and months and months having a really miserable time in intensive care to then die, when actually what they really wanted to do was go outside, have a cup of tea, spend some time with their family and not generally be in hospital at all. So we have to sort of just put that in the context of what I'm going to talk about. And I think back to the data and the stories, is that actually all the things that I try and do day in, day out, and part of my team, now that my colleague's sitting there with his computer off, is we do save money without reducing quality, without having an impact on how people feel. So it's not really a story, and it's sort of, I'm trying to sort of walk a line between anecdote and data without sort of particular stories with the skills that Catherine's got. But when you take the data as a whole, and you ask this sort of theoretical question of people, 2/3 of people, our survey says, they'd like to die at home. And in Sussex, just 20% do so. So there's a complete disconnect for the reasons we've talked about. And the reason Justine had talked about. People are getting older, people are living with many more things wrong with them. People, the first, True North is our trust thing, because I borrowed this I've used this for the trust. That's our aim, is we don't want people dying in our hospital. That's a noble aim, but we have to be good at looking after people outside of hospital. And if they do come into hospital, recognise early how sick they are, and do they need to be in hospital? Can we look after them elsewhere without impacting on the quality of their care and getting on the front page of the Daily Mail? We've done this cancer example, and what you can see, to re-emphasise the point, these big long red bars just show how many times someone with cancer, and there's a variety of ages, some are young, some are old, spend in hospital towards the end of their life unexpectedly. And you take nothing else away, that's not a pleasant experience. It's done with the best of intentions, but hospitals are chaotic places. They're very busy, they're very noisy. Anyone who's ever been in hospital knows. If you possibly can be looked after somewhere else, like a hospice, for instance, or home, then that's probably where you want to be. But the flip side of that is, because it's so chaotic and noisy, you've got doctors, nurses, AHPs, pharmacists, you name it, on standby at your service 24/7. And obviously that costs a lot of money. And again, the thing I took away from Justine's report was just how much money we're talking about when it comes back to trying to make this case. You know, if people come through the front door, that's where it costs you the most amount of money. That's what the Royal College of Emergency Medicine would want me to say, is ring 111, speak to your GP, go to your local pharmacist, those sort of public health messages. But also the serious point is how much money it costs. It's much better to spend money on a planned admission, on a planned contact, and less money from people being in hospital and spend it in home. And again, we've got good data. All this needs to be shared. It doesn't make the Daily Mail test, because the good stories about people can have the same quality of care but be looked after at home and save money doesn't necessarily make headline news. So what I'm now going to just briefly talk about is just trying to mix data and stories by just talking about what patients tell us. So part of this is around what we've tried to do locally, is that we've used this data, we've used this patient experience. What we've actually tried to do is say to patients who we look after with cancer, because I'm using cancer as an example, is to tell us how they're feeling. So they've got lots of questionnaires we can use. We happen to use a nice long questionnaire that people complete online, and we get lots of lovely data. People do it in their own time, they tell us how they're feeling, and we know it's a really sensitive indicator. If people tell us they feel well, then they tend to stay feeling well. So we can use all this data, and we've got quite a lot of it now. So it's back to, but we can use this data to tell us stories, because people can tell us how they're feeling. Yes, specific things, and we can argue about whether they're the right specific things we should be mentioning. But this is how people are telling us. This is not what a blood test or a scan says. So I think it's really powerful, that sort of side of things, and it feeds into the narrative and the story. And then you can present it, as Justine has, in lots of different ways. You can see what happens to people, and then you can map these to the other things we're talking about. So the first example, you can see somebody's doing really, really well, and then suddenly something goes catastrophically wrong. The next one is somebody who's sort of fumbling on a lower level, but holding their own. And then the third example is somebody who has lots of different forms of chemotherapy. Sometimes they respond, and then towards the end, they don't. And people who sort of, think, and people at the bottom who surprise you, you think actually they're dying, and people surprise you, people prove you wrong. People actually improve when you least expect it. So I think that's the other flip side of the story, is that this isn't necessarily a one-way thing that happens when somebody isn't admitted to hospital. People do leave hospital, and people do surprise you. So I think I don't want to take away all hope and just talk about death. I do want to talk about the people that do surprise you, although they are in the minority. And what we get is more data. And I still believe in data, and I love stories, but I do believe in data. And I think data that you can see and you can visualize, and you can clearly pick out the red bits where people are saying they've got a problem. That's what I want to see. I want to see the things that people say are important to them, because I think you can pick some of these things out. Can you get to the shops? Have you got enough energy to do what you want to do? Can you do your bits? Are you fit enough to go on your dream holiday? Do you need, what do you need? And we can do that for all sorts of things. So I just present this as, more data, but I think the importance of what data can feed into somebody can tell you, use this data to then tell more stories. So that was the start of this conversation for me anyway. And just to give NHS England their due, we have had some money to do all this. We did get a 2-year set of money, with the aim of doing what we've all said we want to do. We want to stop people coming into hospital if we can. We don't want to investigate people for the sake of it. We want to meet them at the front door and say, what matters to you? What's important to you? What do you want us to do today? Not, all right, quick, we need to do a blood test, we need to do some x-rays, we need to send you for a scan, and we need to get 15 different teams involved, and we need to hypothesize endlessly about what we may or may not do. You tell us what we want to do, we'll meet at the front door, and ideally we'll turn you around again. Not always, but that's what we aim to do. And because it was a specific project, we started off doing it in cancer. And then we realised, obviously, that that's no use either. So we see anyone who needs us, and that's where the stories come in, because we just see people who we think have needs, or tell us they have needs, or might have need of us. So I think what we're saying is, and what the data can't tell you is which of these people, who they are. What the data can show you is this is a sort of homogenous group of people, and then we meet them at the front door and go, do you need us? And they say yes or no, or a team, we can say to the team, they need us. And the teams can say, yes, we do, or no, we don't, or don't call us, we'll call you, or we'll call you in a week. Any of those sorts of things. So it just fills in what I think we were trying to do, which is just gently, in a chaotic environment, as Catherine says, designed to make people live longer and, you know, do all the hero stuff you see on TV. We just want to be just a nudge in the background saying, actually, do you know what? There's a huge population in this hospital who need us, who need a sensible conversation with people, who need a nice chat, and we can go from there. And that's not underdoing what we do, because it's a very skilled thing that we do. But I do think it's not the main aim of the hospital. So again, take nothing else away. We want to be able to sort of just gently push back at the hospital that's always focused on sort of what's the right reference, either ER, casualty, whatever age you are. Those are the ones I grew up with, and cardiac arrest. Old Jed Mercuro before he went on to right line of duty. It's always about hospitals being saving lives. And what that translates into, a story, not quite Catherine's story, but a sort of similar story, translates into the normal one at the top, where people go through all sorts of investigations, see multiple teams, have multiple referrals, through to us stopping them at the front door and having a conversation about what matters to Mrs. Bright. Now, the nice thing of all of this is you've got a story there in sort of pictorial form around the fact that we transferred somebody to the hospice rather than staying in hospital, and we saved all this time and effort. What we also saved was a huge amount of money. And I think it's important to say that. And here's where the data comes back in again. It depends how often you do that. If you do that once in a blue moon, it's not going to affect the bottom line. If you do that once a week, then someone might start paying attention, because actually you're talking about a significant amount of money, but also the opportunity cost of freeing up staff who enjoy their job more, a much better patient experience. And this is what we're sort of working towards. And this is why I've sort of, you know, we've worked this up. These are figures, just to so Justin doesn't have a big meltdown. These are all proper bona fide NHS costings that the NHS boys and girls have put together. So, you know, you can argue with some of the figures, but we know from the stories and the feedback that we've had that people benefit from this. This is what people tell us. This is where the stories come back in. This is what we're basing ourselves on. This is the qualitative side of all the numbers we've been talking about. People hate coming into hospital. I like to talk about how I'm feeling. I like to talk about my outcomes. I like to talk about, I can tell people remotely, it saves me so much time. It's like a news score for the non-conditions. News is when somebody's very unwell. It just makes your blood pressure and pulse, whereas we can convert that into a news score for someone with cancer who can tell us how they're feeling. And back to the final thing, I can't not mention Twitter after all the things that we've talked about. I've got a trial, obviously, because I am a sort of pseudo-academic. And we're trying to collate all this. We're trying to make it better. We're trying to use the data, have trials, put people in trials, because actually we need the research to prove all this. We need the research to prove what we're doing and the business cases, and using the data and the stories for what we're doing. What we want to do, and I hope what we can take away, is that we want to provide the same level of care for everyone and have much more planned admissions toward the end of somebody's life, rather than lots of unplanned emergency admission. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ollie, and thank you, Justine and Catherine. We don't have long left. We have sort of 3 or 4 minutes left, but I'd just like to ask Catherine whether she has any final reflections, and also really to ask your permission, building on a question we've had in the chat box. It strikes me actually what we've created in this session is a sort of first cut of some training materials for a description of the way that analysts and clinicians and data and story might go well together. So I actually think we have material here that could help analysts in their craft of telling stories with data and in engaging with clinicians, I think we've got quite a powerful resource here. But I wonder if you had any sort of final comments that you wanted to make.
I think you're right that this fusion of the big data and the individual stories really starts to talk to people and bring people up and make them think. I think something that I needed to say as I was presenting those two individual case stories but omitted to say was that I made them up, that in fact we haven't breached confidentiality. The photographs are my family, but when we start to think about them as real people, and it would be possible to, for example, trace these people in order to go back, find the clinicians in hospital. And at the moment, these analyses don't include primary care data, but in the future, I'm sure that's the dream, that all of the data are there. And we can really fully map what a person's experience looks like as data points, but actually to be able to marry that to their patient reported outcomes measures of the sort that Ollie is talking about and match those to people would be absolutely fantastic.
That's excellent. Ollie or Justine, do you have any final closing remarks on, on what perhaps your reflections on what you've learned from this session? Actually, I mean, personally, I've learned a stack about the way in which we might combine data and story, but do you have any final points on that?
I think the point for me perhaps is I've just had a quick look at the chat, and it's really interesting to see how analysts perhaps are genuinely interested in engaging with storytelling. I mentioned that it's not a traditional view of analysts perhaps, but actually the interest in that and the training courses that you know, the kind of things you can look at around helping that is really nice to know. I think it kind of will help analysts develop their skills and make more impact in the future.
That's great. And then any closing remarks, Ollie?
No, just I think this has hopefully been helpful, and the mixed methods are the way forwards. You know, we need both. You can call it data for the head, story for the heart. We need both, and I genuinely believe that. And then that's how the future should be, and that's if we want to be on the front of the Daily Mail for the right reasons.
There's a whole other session in your Daily Mail obsession, I think, Ollie. Look, I just want to extend thanks from everyone who's attended the session, to Catherine, to Justine, and to Ollie. It's been a brilliant session, and I think in fact, in the way that we did it and in the way that we combined data and story, exemplified the point that we were trying to make in many ways. So thank you ever so much to all of our speakers, and thank you everyone else. I'll draw the session to a close there. Thank you.